courthouse looked like a stranded ship at the edge of the sleeping city, its stone hull blackened by a fire that people still argued about. No one disputed the scorch marks, or the way the dome seemed to flinch when the wind pushed in from the river. They disputed the story, the why, the who, the whether or not it should have been saved. The building had outlived its judges, its clerks, its brass scales bolted to the steps. It had not outlived its reputation. Omar K. signed the night shift log at 11:47 p.m., a minute that always felt borrowed. He wrote his name neatly, because his father had taught him that neat letters make a steady life. The pen bled a little where the paper was thin. He lifted his head and looked through the glass walls of the guard booth at the lobby. Estim geometry pillars, marble, the fossil of a seal inlaid in the floor, a pattern worn smooth by a million shoes that had stopped coming years ago. Quiet building, the day guard had said when they switched. You'll think it's talking to you. It isn't. It's just old. Omar nodded then, and nodded again now to the memory, as if to reassure both men. He set his thermos near the keyboard of a computer whose operating system refused to die and tapped the spacebar. The cameras stitched themselves into a grid of grain. Half the boxers were black. The rest held angles of shadow hallways, stairwells, a mockingbird of a reflection where a lens had been left to stare at itself. He made a small tour anyway, because a quiet building is a dare. The keys chimed on his belt. The lobby breathed out a cooler draft that smelled of dust and something like old rope. His footsteps sounded too large. He made an effort to shorten them. When he reached the east stairwell, he paused and listened to the silence the way you listen to a shell, hunting for proof of an ocean. Nothing. He returned to the booth and tried the radio. Static from a different century side back. He shrugged, wrote radio check failed on the legal pad by the keyboard, and then noticed the book. It hadn't been on the desk when he left for his tour. He would have sworn to that, for whatever a stranger's oath is worth. Now it sat to the right of the monitor wall, square with the edge of the desk, its cover dull the way obsidian goes dull when a finger's oil has ruined its edge. No title. The leather looked too thick for the hinges that held it, as if the cover had been repurposed from something larger, something meant to keep weather out. Along the spine, a line of dim, dense stitches, blows from a blunt needle, ran top to bottom. He touched it with 2 fingers. Cold, lost and found, he told the empty room, which was the sort of joke you make to hear yourself say a human phrase. He sat, pulled the book close, and opened it with a caution that made him feel faintly ridiculous. The first page was cream, the fibers visible, the surface loosened by time. At the very top, centered, a single sentence in a hand to steady for first attempts. He frowned, and let out a small, incredulous laugh. Resolved. It sounded like a clerk's euphemism for anything that made paperwork stop. He turned the page. Names, dates, times. A column so thin you could have missed it, and a line ruling that looked hand-drawn with a ruler, not printed. Some entries were decades old. Others were last year, last month, last week. He scanned until the modern digits stopped feeling like numbers and started feeling like an insult to the idea of time. His eyes snagged on a name he knew from a photo that had been reposted all day. Farah Alden. The missing person alert had named the bakery The Root. The fact that she always texted her sister when she got on the bus and this time she didn't tea. The entry in the book gave a date and a time, exact to the minute. It's matched. He closed the book gently, as if loudness could spill something, and sat very still. The building settled in some far corner, a weight deciding it would go a little lower. A whine from the old HVAC, unspooled into a sigh and cut out. He opened the book again because that is what curiosity does to caution. He didn't find an author. He found columns of smaller words tucked under the names on later pages, short phrases clipped. Elementary as a judge's notes. He returns the ring to a pocket that I ascend to his. She says the wrong name when asked who saw her last. He walks left when he says he walked right. Not sentences. Exactly. Sentencings. An urge to classify pressed into the dark. Beside each, a time. He told himself it was an old ledger of case summaries. He told himself lots of people could have written a neat hand with a flareless tool. He told himself stories that fit the building the way a suit fits a body that has changed. Then he reached the last filled page and the first blank one beyond it. The blank page wasn't quite empty. A soft impression traced at the bottom, the ghost of letters in the paper itself, as if handwriting had stained the pulp all the way through and left an afterimage. He angled the desk lamp. The hint of an O became real. An M followed. The upright lines, shallow grooves. He blinked because denial is always the first shelter. The grooves blackened as though touched by a wick rising into flame. Ink bled up from the scratch into legibility. Omar K. September 7th, 2:13. He didn't jump. He also didn't breathe for 2 beats, which felt like choosing not to drown. He ran his thumb across the lower margin, half hoping the ink would smear and glue him to the comfort of a trick. It did not smear. On the monitor wall, camera 12, the east stairwell came alive with a video snow before resolving to concrete gray. A figure occupied the landing between floors. Hands behind his back, head tipped, as if counting a leak in the ceiling no one could see. The time stomp in the corner blinked a minute and then settled. Omar lifted the desk phone out of habit and put it down because there was no one to call. He tried the radio again. Static made a suggestion, then lost its nerve. He looked at the figure on the screen, and then at the hall beyond the booth and the long line of the lobby, the way it funneled toward the stairwell. He took the keys. The lobby sounded different when he wasn't pretending to patrol it sharper, like a room where a story had been told too many times. He walked with the beam of his flashlight low to avoid giving the dark anything to aim at. The east stairwell door shuddered when he opened it. A thin cake of ash shook loose from the top hinge and fell. some of it onto his shoulder. He brushed it away and felt the smell rise a museum's deep closet, a church's unclean candle, a summer basement that flooded once and never forgot. The landing was empty. He played the light up the well, over the edges of concrete where a painter's yellow had lasted like optimism. No man, no echo of a man. The camera had been wrong, or the distance between frames had swallowed him. He stood very still and felt watched. He turned slowly. A board near the base of the far wall sat wrung by a finger's width, walked outward. He eased it with the screwdriver on his key ring. Something behind the board had been squeezed until it learned the wall's shape. The book slid into his hands. He almost laughed, and the laugh turned into a breath he didn't trust. He had left the ledger on the desk. He hadn't imagined that. The impression where it had rested still marked the dust when he thought of it. He weighed the volume, which felt heavier than its size. He carried it back to the booth with his arms straight. Like a man carrying out a hazardous material he intends to keep away from his body. On the way, the sound came. A tape's soft click, the wheel catching, the hesitating whine as it reached speed. He hadn't seen a cassette deck in the booth the first time. He saw one now. It was small and black with a crack in the acrylic window over the spools, the kind of machine police departments used when they still preferred to listen to the world in minutes instead of files. A woman's voice filled the glass room as if it had been sitting in the air, waiting for him to return to be allowed out. Inspector Layla Haddad, the voice said, tired and unsentimental. Day 91, after the fire. If this is playing in that building, it is because the book is open, and if the book is open, then I'm not there to close it. Omar set the ledger on the desk without taking his hands off it. He put his mouth near the tape, as though it would answer questions. "Who are you?" he said, and felt foolish, but the voice continued as if she had anticipated interruption and refused to acknowledge it. "The ledger is not a record," she said. "It was once. It is an appetite now. Every name it keeps is completed before dawn one way or another. We looked for someone writing in it. We looked for someone carrying it. We were wrong. The book writes what the city refuses to say out loud." He found his name again. On the page, the numerals of the time sat like an appointment the body remembers, even if the mind politicizes it. The minute hand on his watch had a loud idea about how quickly it would get there. He adjusted the band because the leather felt slick. "Pattern," the tape said. "3 names in a night when the book is hungry. Sometimes there are pauses when the book feeds. The thud is always a keeper of the building. A guard, a custodian, a clerk left with the keys after everyone decent has gone home. If you are hearing this after midnight and you have the book in your hands, you are likely the third name. A flare of anger cut across the fear. Small but bright. Likely, he said to nobody. Likely is not a verdict. He flipped back to the earlier pages and looked for anything he could use. There were marks on some margins, faint smudges where a graphite grip had deepened a line. He saw folded corner two-thirds of the way through and opened to it. 3 short columns. Name, date, sentence. But the sentences were not events. They were phrases that landed like instructions. Admit what you miscounted. Return what isn't yours. Knock on the door you did not knock on. The hand had no flourish, no italics, no desperation, just duty. He took his hands off the ledger and folded them to keep from fidgeting. "All right," he said, because saying "all right" makes a shape you can stand inside. "What do you want?" The room did not answer. It altered. The monitors sharpened. Camera 7. The west hallway woke into a reflection of the dome as it looked before the fire. Polished. Perfect. A lie made of light. Then the image shivered and returned to present. In the reflection, for a moment, he saw a second booth behind him, where there was none. He turned. The glass held only his own face, pale and intent. He returned to the desk and began the small things that make men feel less alone. He made a list. He wrote down the exit doors and which keys matched them. He wrote down the locations of fire extinguishers that had not been serviced in 3 years. He wrote down that the radio did not work, that the phone would reach voicemail in a department that still had a recorded greeting and nothing else. He wrote down the time, 12:41. When he looked back at his name in the ledger, a faint gray phrase had appeared below it, too light to read at first, then clarifying as if printed by fog. He writes what he has never told. About what? He asked, half amused, despite himself. He felt the old cautiousness return, the one he wore when answering official forms that left no good place for the real answer. About everything, the tape, which he had not touched, resumed. "There is a way to interrupt a name," Layla's voice said. "We learned it late and wrong, and at cost. The ledger can be made to accept a truer entry. Not ethics, not fairness. Truer. A confession the court refused. A sentence the city declined to say. Whose confession?" Omar asked the little machine, and heard in his own tone the soft complaint people reserve for bad instructions. "Mine. Yours will help," she said, and he understood that will carried away might never would. But one truth is not a diet. You need a second voice that unriddles the first. He thought of the page with the folded corner, the insistent verbs. He thought of Farah's name. He thought of the building itself, which felt like a person with a fever pressed against the glass to look in at him. He checked the clock again and hated that it went forward. He left the booth and crossed the lobby to the blackened door of evidence. The brass plate had bent in the heat. The engraved letters were soft as if underwater. The new lock shone indecently. He fit the cartoonish key, turned and pushed. The room smelled like a library whose last visitor had been a match. Rows of metal shelves wore cardboard the way hospital beds wear sheets. Some boxers had been relabeled by tidy people after the fire. Some were charcoaled along the edges where someone had packed them with hands that shook. The ceiling above the far wall had the patterned scars of flame-chasing paint that bubbled and ran. He set the ledger on a steel table and walked the aisles the way you walk. A strange pet you have not decided to keep. Numbers. Case numbers. Years. On a low shelf. A cassette lay in a clear bag with an evidence tag. He lifted it by the top as he had been taught in a safety briefing that mostly discussed slip hazards. The ink on the tag had bled when water hit it. A ballpoint correction had been written over the blur. Case 17 to 19. He did not know what that meant. Only that the strokes were made by a left-handed writer who pressed too hard. He brought the tape to the table. He looked at the book and the machine as though either might object. The objection did not come. He slipped the cassette into the recorder. The spools turned with a small, honest sound. A man's voice, younger than Omar expected, spoke out of some winter long ago. "I lied," the man said without drama. "I said he was there. He wasn't. I said I saw him. I didn't. They told me my brother would keep his job if I signed the paper. I signed. I am sorry." The room shivered and became still again. In the ledger, the bottom of the page seemed to ripple once, as if the paper had become shallow water and a fish had rolled just under the surface. Omar leaned close. A new line appeared beneath Farah's name, beside the time the book had allotted to her. Deferred. His breath came back into him like a late bus that finally rounds the corner, and he almost laughed, and didn't. He looked upward, not at anything particular, the reflex of prayer without its words. When his eyes dropped to his own name, the line was the same as it had been. The minutes were not sympathetic. More Layla's voice said from the little speaker, not unkindly, "It needs more to let you go." What more could it possibly want? He heard the edge now, not of anger, exactly, but of a person who is tired of being polite to strange requirements. "Yours," she said, "but not a report. Not neat letters. The sentence you avoided. Tell it in a room that hears. Sign it, feed it." He closed his eyes for a moment in a habit of checking the internal shelves. The thing he had never said was not a revelation exactly. It was simple. Simple things are hardest to pick up. He reached for the recorder and pressed the red circle as if pressing a wound. "My name is Omar K." He began, steady on the second try. 2 years ago I watched a man be taken for something he did not do. I was there. I saw where he was not. I could have said one sentence that would have bent the night. I chose quiet. I wanted my job. I wanted to be nobody. I am saying it now. He was not there. I was. He stopped the tape. The recorder made a small clack that sounded louder than it was. He placed the cassette on the ledger as one places something small and living into a box you hope is lined with air. The paper did not change, and then it did no drama. No black smoke. No flutter of 1,000 pages. His name thinned, as if the ink had been asked to explain itself and failed. It faded to the color of ash, and then to the color of the paper beneath it, and then to nothing. He realized he was holding the table's edge hard enough to press crescents into his palms. He let go, and sensation returned as pins, then as hands. On camera for the lobby framed a figure behind the door that should have been locked. A woman stepped in with the authority of memory, shut the door by habit, and walked toward the booth as if the room remembered where she had always stood. She held up an ID to the glass that she did not need to hold. Omar could read the name from where he stood. Layla. Haddad Inspector Rhett. He opened the booth door before she knocked. She looked tired in the way that says the tiredness has been paid for in advance. "We've met," she said, and he understood she meant on tape. "We have until dawn to decide whether you want this to be over just for you, or over in a way that sticks." "Hi," he almost said. "I just wanted a quiet job." He stopped, because wanting is not a sentence you can feed to anything that eats truth. How does it stick? She glanced toward the ledger with the kind of dislike usually reserved for an abuser who thinks he is a poet. "We give the book more than a meal. We give it what it pretends to be. We give it court. We take the tapes that should have been heard, the statements that were never permitted past the throat, the small sentences that should have registered but got filed under a mayor's smile. And we make a record it cannot deny." He nodded because nodding is easier than thinking. "Will that stop it? It will change it," she said. "Stopping is a kind of myth. The changing is real. It's ugly, and it takes more nights than we have fingers to count, and it hurts worse than burning, and the city won't thank you." She saw his face and soft a degree. "But people might live who otherwise wouldn't." A new line had appeared at the bottom of the page as they spoke. Unlike the others, it had no name yet, just a dash, just the time that hadn't picked its hour. The book seemed, absurdly, to be waiting to be told how to be hungry. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means it's listening," she said. "The building listens when it's taught how. You taught it something. Now teach it more." Somewhere above them, the dole made the sound that was not a bell. Omar didn't know if it was the wind finding a new mouth or the old metal remembering how to be struck. He looked at the door of evidence and felt a future opening inside the hour, like a second room behind a wall he had taken for solid. "You could leave," Layla said, "because good teachers tell you the bad option. Take your victory. Go home. Sleep through the morning. I've seen men do it. They were fine until they weren't." He smiled, a thin, surprised thing, because he felt at once stupid and clear. "I signed the log," he said, and she blinked before she understood his small joke. The neat letters, the steady life, and the corner of her mouth admitted the possibility of a smile in return. He picked up the keys. He picked up the ledger. He picked up the recorder, which was heavier now. The way a tool becomes heavier when you learn the cost of using it. The monitors watched them walk out of the booth. Two small bodies in a building too big, which is the size of almost every story that ever mattered. Outside, in a city that thinks it has learned how to sleep with one eye open, A bus paused at a light and went on. A bakery oven cooled. A river under asphalt made its own decisions in the dark. The courthouse, which had not been forgiven, felt the air change as the door to the evidence room opened again, and two people who were not as alone as they had been stepped into the aisle between the shelves to look for sentences the day had refused. The second hand on Omar's watch stuttered once and then moved, steady, toward a dawn that would be messy, as dawns are, but would come. The city's nights had a temperature of their own, a chill not measured in degrees, but in memory. When Omar stepped back into the evidence room with Inspector Layla Haddad, the air had that chill like opening a freezer door and finding not food but breath. Rows of steel shelving rose around them, groaning under the weight of boxers labeled with numbers that meant nothing to him but everything to her. Layla moved like a surgeon returning to a theater she had abandoned, her eyes scanning the scars of the fire, the melted corners, the crooked tags, as if the room itself were a witness she could cross-examine. "The ledger's appetite follows a rhythm," she said. Her voice was level, stripped of ceremony. "3 names when it is hungry. 1 tonight already taken. 1 deferred." Her gaze flicked toward him, sharp as a gavel. "And you." Omar's throat tightened. His name had thinned on the page earlier, but he felt it clinging still, like a stain on his skin. "It erased me," he whispered. "For now," Layla said, "deferred is not absolution. The book keeps its own double-entry system. If it isn't fed enough truth, it comes back to balance the books." She pulled a box down from the shelf, the cardboard hissing as it scraped metal. Inside were scorched files, corners singed, pages stuck together by old water. She flipped with the efficiency of someone who had done this too many times before. Case 17 to 19 was the beginning of the fire. They buried more than evidence that night. They buried a voice. Omar looked around at the boxers. Whose voice? Layla's eyes held his, dark and steady. "Mine. Confession in act." She laid a cassette down on the table. It was warped at the edge. Plastic blistered, label half-earsed. Only her handwriting, faded, but legible, survived. Haddad's statement. Omar swallowed. "You recorded yourself." "I tried to put truth on tape when the court refused it," she said. "But the ledger doesn't accept truths that stay hidden. It demands an audience, even if that audience is only the building itself. That's why it still waits." She slotted the cassette into the recorder. The wheels turned reluctantly, squealing as if resisting resurrection. A younger voice. Her own emerged, brittle but fierce. "This is Inspector Layla Haddad, official investigator on the courthouse fire. I testify that the fire was no accident. It was set to erase testimony, to destroy records, to silence a confession, and I testify that I was ordered to look away." The tape hissed, warped, continued. "I cannot look away. If this tape is found, it means I failed to stop them. It means the ledger will keep feeding until someone tells the truth louder than the city's." Silence. The recording clicked to a stop. Omar stared at her, Why didn't anyone ever hear this? Because they buried it in the very place where the fire began. She touched the blackened ceiling, and because I didn't die that night, survival makes people uncomfortable. They prefer martyr. The ledger reacts. The book lay on the table between them. Its cover seemed to pulse faintly, though Omar told himself it was only the play of flashlight beams. He opened it to the current page. His own name still ghosted there, gray but stubborn. Beneath it, the ink began to shift, a new line forming slowly, as if drawn by an invisible hand reluctant to be rushed. Next entry, 3:07. Omar checked his watch. 48 minutes. Another name? He asked, voice thin. Layla nodded. The ledger wants 3. It has to. If we don't supply a third with a truer sentence, it will claim one of its own. She didn't answer immediately. She pulled another file box, leafed through, and set down a photograph. Farah Aldine, flower on her hands, a tired smile, the missing woman. Omar's stomach dropped. But it already wrote her, deferred, Layla corrected. She isn't gone yet. She's the pivot. If we give the ledger the truth of her case, it might release her completely. Breaking the pattern, they searched file after file, each smelling of mold and smoke. Omar's hands blackened with soot. Layla's motions sharp and practiced. At last they found a folder with Farah's name typed on brittle paper. Inside, transcripts, interviews, a deposition scratched with notes in a clerk's hasty hand. It told a story that didn't match the headlines. Farah had witnessed something in exchange in the bakery after hours. A bribe slipped. A threat muttered. She had spoken once, then recanted. The court closed the case. Silence was cheaper than protection. Omar read aloud a line from her first statement. I saw the man in the gray coat pass the envelope. I saw him put it in the judge's bag. Layla tapped the words. This is the sentence. The court buried it. The ledger will take it. She tore the page free and laid it on the ledger's open leaves. For a moment, nothing. Then the ink bled outward, curling around the paper, swallowing it like water, taking sugar. The words faded into the page, leaving only the day-to-night's date glowing faintly before sinking into silence. On the next line, Farah's name dissolved. Vanished. The space where it had been closed like a healed wound. The unfinished column. Omar sagged in relief. So it worked. She's free. Tonight, Layla said quietly. But the ledger never closes. It will open again tomorrow. And the next night, until someone finds the truth it cannot digest. He stared at her. What does that mean? It means, she said, that feeding it scraps is survival. Starving, it takes something larger. Before he could reply, the tape recorder clicked on by itself, spinning without a hand. Her younger voice spoke again. Words neither of them remembered recording. 3 in a night. 3 in a night. The third is always the keeper of the keys. The ledger's page shifted. The faint gray letters of Omar's name darkened. bold once more. Beneath it, a phrase wrote itself in precise, merciless hand. He signs what he denied. Cliffhanger 2, Chapter 3. Omar slammed the book shut, but the words burned behind his eyes. His throat clenched as if an invisible noose had been drawn. He turned to Layla, desperate. I confessed. I gave it truth. Why is my name still here? Layla's face was stone. Because the ledger isn't asking for your silence anymore. It's asking for your perjury. The lights above flickered, buzzing like wasps. Somewhere deep in the courthouse, a door banged shut without a hand. And on the monitor in the booth, camera 12, the east stairwell showed not one figure waiting now, but 3. The figures on camera 12 didn't move like people. They arranged themselves at staggered heights on the east stairwell, each occupying a land in the way numbers occupy a column meant to be read downward to a sum. Omar watched the picture grain and settle around them, watched the pale hum of the fluorescent tube sketch shoulders and elbows out of shadows, and could not tell if he was looking at men or at the idea of men. The third is always the keeper of the keys, Layla said softly, as if to herself. But the book will accept an exchange if the equation is honest. Equation, Omar repeated, tasting the dry word. He opened the ledger again to the page that had failed to forget him. Beneath his name, the phrase had deepened. He signs what he denied. The ink stood on the paper like a bruise raised to the touch. What did you deny in writing? Layla asked. He felt the answer assembled behind his sternum like a slow storm. Not the witness statement. Not the witness, that's the point. His mouth had gone dry. He forced it open. 2 years ago, case 17 to 19. Esekoe refused to sign the midnight log that put me on the corner when the arrest happened. The sergeant told me to initial the box. I said I'd forgotten my pen and walked out. And the court accepted you were somewhere else because there was no signature to prove otherwise. Layla said, not accusing cataloging. I thought I was protecting myself by erasing a line. Omar said, I was making a hole that swallowed someone else. On the monitor, one of the figures rotated, a pivot that did not shift weight so much as the idea of weight. The timestamp ticked. 2:49. Layla's eyes had that far look people get when they run a map in their heads. The denial is clerical, she said. Then the remedy is clerical. We hold a session. A real one. Oath, record, signatures. We reconstruct the thing the night failed to do. In a court, without a judge, Omar said. She nodded at the book. Unfortunately, we have one. They moved quickly because speed makes courage easier to counterfeit. In the clerk's office, drawers had fused when the heat came. Omar had to shoulder a cabinet until it released a sound like a groan and slid. Behind the warped wood they found the witness oath registered, cover ballisted, its corners rounded by flame. When he lifted it, ash-gusted like old snow. Inside, the pages had been numbered by hand. Each entry recorded a name, a case, the raised right hand. The words spoken in the manner of a ritual that doesn't belong to any church but always sounds like one. At the back, on a page that had graphite permanently ground into the fibers, Omar saw his own name ghosted just as it had been in the ledger before the ink rose. No witness number, no signature, an absence in the shape of him. He felt suddenly, irrationally, that the building had saved the page for him the way a seed is saved with a coat. Not kindness, exactly, but an assertion that a presence was expected and would be held. Pen, Layla said. Right, he said, and found that the night had made a parody of his old excuse. His pockets were full of pens now, heavy as penance. He chose the one that wrote the way his father taught him, fine black line, no flourish, and held it above the signature line. He did not press down. He did not yet. Layla said, "The oath first." They carried the oath register and the ledger into the main courtroom, whose doors opened with a theatricality that would have been funny at noon. The benches had been cleaned after the fire, because the city had once considered reopening this room for tours. The wood smelled faintly of furniture polish where the heat hadn't eaten it. The judge's bench stared down at them, scorched at the bottom edge. A smile burned into its mouth. "Stand there," Layla said, indicating the space in front of the bench where witnesses had stood for 100 years and learned how a room can make a person small. "Raise your right hand." He imagined the row of portraits in the hall leaning closer to listen, their painted hair and painted mouths alert for the shape of a sentence that might survive them. "State your name," she said. "Omar, do you swear to tell the truth you refused, the whole of it, as far as it is yours to tell, and to sign what you once declined to sign?" "I do," he said, and his voice didn't tremble. "Because there comes a point past which trembling is a luxury." "Then speak," Layla said, and stepped back, not as a judge and not as counsel, but as a clerk making space for a record. He told the room the small, ugly story. His shift, the corner, the face of the man the police had wanted, the fact of the absent. He described the time the bus had passed, the color of the ad on its side, because details are the bones of truth. He named the sergeant who had offered him the log. He described the act of saying, "I forgot my pen," and walking away with his hands empty and his conscience full. He did not ask the heir for forgiveness, because he had learned that forgiveness is not a contract you can draft alone. When he finished, the courthouse felt briefly larger, as if walls had stepped back an inch to make room for a new object on the floor. "Sin," Layla said, and her voice was fragile there, not with fear but with the cost of hope. He signed. He dated. He printed letters in the oath register, and then, at Layla's nod, he made a duplicate on a blank incident form and signed that as well. Because bureaucracy is repetition, and sometimes repetition is the only way to make truth heavier than a lie. "Seal?" she said. The brass notary seal had survived in a drawer because metal keeps its patience. She set it over the edge of the paper and pressed. The emboss creaked into the fibers with a sound that landed on Omar's spine like a verdict. He held the paper up. The circular pattern caught the dim light, a raised halo around his name. "Record?" Layla said, turning to the tape recorder. "Read it again." He read it into the machine. The same words, no new guilt and no new heroics. When the tape clicked off, the courthouse did that trick again, breathing like a creature that had been holding itself rigid and finally allowed the air to enter and leave. They laid the sealed statement on the open leaves of the ledger the way a sacrifice is laid on an altar in an old story, except that this altar had been built by civil servants, and the ritual was scribed in forms rather than blood. For an instant to nothing. Then the seal's raised metal impression softened as if wax, sank into the page, and was gone. The ink under Omar's name paled. The words he signs, what he denied, unstitched themselves letter by letter and drifted apart like smoke without wind. Omar's name followed. Gray, lighter, a gap. He exhaled. "Is it over?" "2/3 of it," Layla said, and looked toward the double doors of the courtroom as if expecting a procession. "The book eats in 3s. As if in obedience, the monitor in the booth, that steady little grid that had held so many varieties of shadow, flickered into the room as silence. Camera 12 showed the stairwell again. 2 of the figures had vanished. 1 remained. It stood on the middle landing now, directly beneath the sign indicating the second floor. Its head tilted at a listening angle that read as patience. "Third name," Omar said. "It wants a third name." Layla nodded once. "There is always a hand behind the hand that holds the match." He understood what she didn't yet say and what her face couldn't avoid saying. "The man in the gray coat?" he said. "The envelope. The judge's bag." "Not the judge," Layla said. "He took the money because somebody offered it at the right time to the right fear. The appetite he served wasn't his. The person who set the fire ordered me to look away." That voice signed the requisitions for faulty sprinklers. That voice approved overtime cuts that left the building empty at midnight and always between inspections. That voice called my supervisor and said the word career in a tone that rhymed with fire. "City attorney," Omar said. He felt it the way you feel a dental ache, a pressure underbone that names itself. "Or the man who will be city attorney in a month." Layla's mouth flattened into a line that was not quite a smile. "You have good ears. Does the ledger accept that kind of name?" Omar asked. "A person with power who has never stepped into the building after dark. Someone who will never confess. It will accept a sentence truer than his," Layla said. "But it won't take rumor. It needs a record with tit." She turned to her box of salvaged papers. "We need his own words. It should have been impossible to find them. It is a quality of certain men that they never write the sentence that can end them. But institutions have a way of making trade." Layla sorted until her fingers were black. Omar ran to the administrative office and pried open a desk with a length of molding he had broken off a chair. In the bottom drawer, wedged beneath a tangle of promotional posters printed for a charity gala, he found a microcassette in a plastic cradle with a sticky note that read, "In penso prepto KS." They didn't have a microcassette recorder. The old cassette deck on the table had only ever eaten spools the size of a thumb. Layla closed her eyes for one murderous second and then was moving again, out of the courtroom, down the hall to a glass-fronted office whose door still bore the gold-leaf title chief clerk. She used a key she shouldn't have had and swung the door wide. On a shelf, forgotten because the future forgot obsolete machines, sat a micro-cassette transcriber with a foot pedal. They carried it back like a relic. Omar clicked the tiny cassette into the slot. The machine obeyed with a dusty whir. A voice leaked into the room, confident and bored and careful, the way people sound when they assume they are among friends who will never stop being friends. And we're going to have to do a controlled records reduction, the voice said. I can't be clearer on a recorded line. So consider this a rehearsal. If a fire code inspection fails on a day when the building is unoccupied and the sprinkler loop is not fully charged due to budgetary oversight, that will be a tragedy, of course. And we'll all be very sad. And then we'll be very relieved that 20 years of liabilities are suddenly... Do you understand me? Layla had trained her face to hold still across whole careers. It didn't hold still now. Play it again, she said. Omar did. And when the sentence turned the same hard cornery chords reduction, he pressed the red button on the larger recorder and captured the smaller Machine S offense into a cassette the ledger liked to eat. When it was done, he stopped both. Rewound both, played both again until he could feel the shape of the man S smirk in the cadence of the words. Name, the ledger seemed to suggest, though it did not speak, only lay there open, a black mouth waiting. Layla took a pen, she wrote, on the sealed incident form that bore Omar's embossed confession, a neat addendum in the margin. Supplemental recording. A.S. Then Deputy Counsel. Recontrolled records reduction. She dated it. She signed as witness. She looked at Omar. He signed as present. It felt absurd and therefore correct. They placed the supplemental record on the ledger. For an instant, the book did nothing. Then the ink along 3 older entries on the page rose as if the names swelling, darkening, and then resolving into something faint and less accusatory than before, like a long-held breath that changes shape but doesn't end. On camera 12, the last figure on the stairwell put one hand on the banister and did not move again. The time stamp ticked, 3:06. The stairwell light shivered once, twice, and steadied. The ledger's bottom line, which had been blank, accepted a new hand. Not S. S. Not Layla's. Not Omar's. The letters formed with an odd, official slowness. The court beneath it. Closed session. Beneath that, in the smallest hand yet, the sentence. Here's what it refused and keeps it where it can't burn. It took the institution, Omar whispered, not the man. It took what we made real, Layla said. We held a session. We gave it the object it pretends to be. It can feed on men forever. Or it can be made to feed on itself. Is that just it? Omar asked, which is a question people ask when they have just survived and wish to stand on firmer ground than survival. It's a start that doesn't end with a body, Layla said. The courthouse announced on the way damaged things do by failing in lesser ways. The fluorescents gave up a third of their fight and went from white to the tired color of old teeth. Outside, the city bled pink along the edges of buildings that had been embarrassed by the dark. The air changed. Not warmer, not yet, but with new instructions. Omar closed the ledger because somebody had to. The cover met the lower board with a sound that was not quite a thud and not quite a sigh. He half expected it to grow hot or cold in his hands. It was only heavy. "What now?" he asked. "You go home," Layla said. "You sleep, if you can." She picked up the oath register, which looked less like a relic and more like a tool now. "And then you come back tonight." "To do what?" he said, already hearing the answer in the question. She headed for the door with the economy of a person who no longer expends energy on ceremony. "To open a session the city cannot close." He followed her into the lobby, whose fossil seal had acquired a patch of light at its edge. As the morning found a way through the broken dome, on the monitor, camera 12 showed only a stairwell. No figures waited there. The banister held no hand that could be mistaken for shadow. The time stomp rolled past 307 without comment. At the door, Layla stopped and looked back at the room that had held them. "You should know," she said, "that AS won't confess. Men like that don't. But he will feel something he hasn't in years. Risk. The tape will find him. Or we will. Either way, the book will be open, and he will have to decide which door to close." Omar nodded. "And if we stop coming, then it goes back to eating," she said. "But it will never be as easy for it as it was. You made a groove in the world tonight." "The world remembers grooves." They stepped into the morning. The city's first bus sighed at a stop a block away. A bakery opened its door for his place. Omar realized with a thud of gratitude sharp enough to be pain. A woman inside turned a sign from closed to open with a hand dusted in flour. He couldn't see her face from here. He didn't need to, Inspector, he said. "Don't," she said, and smiled, small and unguarded, just once. "It's Layla. I retired when the city learned to pretend my kind of work isn't needed anymore." "Your kind of work?" he asked, listening to what nobody wants to say out loud. She said. She handed him the key ring. "Keeper of the keys. There's poetry in the job whether we like it or not." He took the ring. It felt lighter than it had at midnight. Or maybe his hands were heavier, which is another way to say the same thing. They parted at the steps. She walked without hurry, as if she had every right to the sidewalk and the hour. He stood for a moment and watched the building they had made both more and less dangerous in a single night. When he finally turned to go, he saw, in the corner of his eye, a movement behind the glass of the guard booth. The ledger lay on the desk where he had left it, closed, unremarkable. Beside it, the oath register sat open to a fresh page. The line at the bottom, tonight's date, waited stubbornly empty, the way a lake waits for the first stone. He looked at the sky, which had decided against evidence, as it always does, to be bright. He imagined the room filled with voices that were never given a room. He imagined the tape spinning and spinning until it wore a groove into plastic so deep it could not be smoothed. He went home to wash his hands and sleep off the kind of fear that leaves fingerprints on bone. He dreamed, when he finally slept, of a courtroom with no furniture, Only a circle of people passing a small machine from palm to palm, taking turns, saying the thing that cost the most and therefore bought something real. When he returned that night, the monitor grid woke at the first tap, obedient and different, as if it recognized a password he didn't know he'd learned. The stairwell was empty, but not indifferent. The ledger opened not by itself but because he pulled the cover back and placed on the page a new paper that had not existed yesterday. A public notice drafted by Layla and typed on a city template. She still knew how to access a summons to anyone with a truth the court refused. He set the notice between the book's leaves. It did not. Closed session, he said aloud to the quiet building. Open hearing. He thought of the final line that had written itself at dawn. Here's what it refused and keeps it where it can't burn. He didn't know if it was a promise or a threat. He knew only that, for the first time since he signed the night log at 11:47 p.m., he wanted to be here. He sat in the chair that leaned a little left, put the thermos down, and waited for a city to talk.